Welcome back, everyone. I hope you're doing well. Today, we are continuing the Crusade. So yeah, last episode, Peter Bartholomew, that's how you say his name, this Peter guy right here, he died because he thought he had the lance of Christ, the lance that killed Christ. Thought he had that. He definitely knew he didn't have that, unless he's just crazy. Long story short, burned himself to death because he tried to prove a point. Didn't work. And here we are. I don't even think we ended the last chapter, so we might have a little bit of the last chapter into the new chapter. But today we're talking about Jerusalem. So let's go. Let's go.
In pain, Peter died and was buried at the site of the trial. The Holy Lance was now nothing more than a worthless piece of metal, and Raymond's reputation was severely damaged.
That's crazy.
He tried to save face by fetching one of his followers to grab Bishop Ademar's piece of the true cross, replacing one relic with another, but by this point the people had lost interest. Around this time, Tancred switched his allegiance and joined in with Godfrey's forces. It was finally time for Raymond to admit defeat and march south in the first week of May. The Count managed to bring the princes together, feed them, and make them rich. But as he neared Jerusalem, he knew that he failed at both securing himself as a leader and carving out a principality of his own. After the failure at Acre, the Crusaders regrouped and marched on Jerusalem, taking a vow to not distract themselves with any other side missions. The princes consulted local Christians and Muslims in order to pick the safest and fastest route towards the city.
And remember, this originally was just against the Seljuks, but now the Fatimids, they are also an adversary now.
Until finally agreeing with a Muslim guide supplied by the Emir of Tripoli, who led them across the coastal road. On one hand, this was the quickest road, which allowed for continuous naval supply, but it also had several narrow passes, ideal spots for an ambush, making it risky. On their first day, the Crusaders marched through one of those passes in single file, a place called Ras az-Cheka, the face of God, but there was no sign of the Fatimid forces. On the 19th of May 1099, they entered Palestine by crossing the Dog River. On the next day, upon reaching Sidon, their foragers were attacked by the Muslim garrison, before being beaten back by a group of mounted knights. In fact, the local wildlife was so far the biggest threat to the outsiders, after a number of them succumbed to the venomous bites of some deadly snakes.
Dang, that's not talked about a lot. It's like the environmental animal effects of these things, like war. Not talked about a lot. One day we'll talk about a saltwater crocodile massacre, which is far more horrible in the 40s of World War II. But this, yeah, probably some cobras or something over here.
During the following nights, the Crusaders banged stones together to protect themselves from the vipers.
Vipers, also bad.
A new strategy was adopted, where after several days of marching, the army would stop and rest for a day. Tyre, Acre, and Caesarea.
Wait, we missed that. What does that say? Locals given the Franks tips on how to counteract these attacks. Snake attacks? Suggesting that a man who was bitten should lie at once with a woman with a man, and thus they would be released from all their swelling and heat of the poison. Not sure that works, but go for it.
Also showed no signs of resistance. The cannibalistic and savage nature of the Crusaders dissuaded the enemy garrisons, while the Crusaders didn't want to repeat the misfortunes of Marat.
Now, let's be clear here, because if you guys are joining us for the first time, this might be very misleading. Cannibalistic nature of the Crusaders, that's not part of their nature. That's part of everyone's nature. Maybe. Depends on who you are. But they were on the brink of death, and they had no other option, they thought. It's not like they were tribally eating people because of victory or something.
On May 30th, the Latins sent a scouting party to inspect the last major settlement before Jerusalem, Ramleh, only to discover that it had been completely abandoned. This town had both strategic and spiritual importance, as it featured the Basilica of St. George, a patron who the Crusaders hoped would guide them to victory. It is here that we truly see how far Raymond had fallen, as the Crusaders elected Robert of Rouen to garrison and hold the city. The power and influence within the Crusade had firmly shifted from the southern French lords to the northern. On June 6th, the resupplied army set off towards Jerusalem and encountered a group of local Christians from Bethlehem who begged them to free their city immediately. Tancred was dispatched.
So that looks like the Fatimid flag, right?
Leading 100 knights who rode through the night and secured Christ's birthplace after the locals welcomed him with open arms. A huge mass was held at the Church of Nativity before Tancred rejoined the main host, having raised his banner on one of the most important holy sites in Christendom. Upon his return on June 7th, he witnessed the army already setting camp, men and women who travelled thousands of kilometers now standing in front of the historic walls of Jerusalem. The Fatimids' ineptitude allowed the Crusaders to cover 300 kilometers within a month, but at the cost of having no line of communication back to Antioch. The Crusaders were well aware that they had to risk everything, and now there was no way back. While many believed in the force of divine protection.
Hold on, this is interesting. I'm just gonna read this real quick. We got the Dome of the Rock, the Dome of the Chain, which is like this, the mosque and the, what do you call it? I'm so smart. The synagogue, right? Or not synagogue. I'm not sure what it is at this time. I'm really not. If it's a church, it's a synagogue, if it's a mosque. We have a mosque at the bottom. I'm not sure. That's just my ignorance. We got the Jewish quarter. We got the Armenian quarter. We have a Christian quarter. We have an old city. We have a Muslim quarter at the top right. Interesting here, because the Christians should definitely pose no threat to the Christian quarter, but the Muslim quarter at the top right might be the biggest threat. Armenian quarter might be a threat. I'm not sure about. We'll see. We'll see what happens. I don't know.
The leadership understood that success could only be achieved by throwing everything they had at the walls of the holy city. There would be no protracted siege like in Antioch, not even an encirclement. There would only be death or glory. Between them and the finish line stood massive walls, 4 kilometers long, 15 meters high, and 3 meters thick. To the east and west, the Judean hills acted as a natural barrier. The ground to the north and southwest was flatter, however those positions were reinforced by the secondary outer wall and several dry moats. There were 5 major gates, each guarded by a pair of towers. In the northwest corner stood a stronghold called the Quadrangular Tower, while midway along the western wall stood the Tower of David itself, made up of solid stones sealed with molten lead. It took no more than 15 men to turn that giant heap of rock into an impregnable fortress. The Fatimid Caliphate had just regained Jerusalem from the Seljuks the previous year.
Yeah, because at the beginning of this, I remember this was under the Seljuk territory. I wonder if that was like a conquest or if that was more like a deal that they made.
Under the leadership of Vizier Al-Afdal Shahanshah, who believed the Crusaders to be no more than Byzantine mercenaries who were easy to control.
I mean, that's what I see them as. I see them as Byzantine mercenaries. And that's what Alexios sees them as Byzantine mercenaries. But to themselves, they're more than that.
As for the garrison in Jerusalem, it was commanded by the Fatimid governor of Palestine, Iftikhar ad-Dawla. We don't know the exact number of troops, but it is said that the governor had a sizable contingent of footmen and archers, reinforced by 400 fresh Egyptian cavalrymen. He expelled most of the Christians living in the city and poisoned all the nearby wells, while filling all of the cisterns in the city. The circumstances were dire, but the Crusader resolve had never been stronger. One Latin chronicler recounts the atmosphere by describing Tancred as he stood on the Mount of Olives. He turned his gaze towards the city, from which he was now shepherd, separated only by the valley of Josaphat, and saw the Lord's sepulchre. Drawing a great sigh, he sat down on the ground and would willingly have given his life there and then just for the chance to press his lips to that most holy church.
Dang.
The Latins had 1,300 knights and 12,000 soldiers, divided into many camps with barely enough cohesion to hold them together. There were now 2 remaining factions.
Notice no Bohemond. No Bohemond. No Baldwin. I thought this was what they wanted to do as well, so this is just curious for them not to be there.
The larger one, led by Godfrey of Bouillon, Robert of Flanders, and Tancred, moved to besiege the city from the north, between the Quadrangular Tower and St. Stephen's Gate, while Raymond of Toulouse and the southern French set up camp before the Tower of David, before relocating in front of the Zion Gate. Godfrey was now the definitive leader of the Crusade, and was even granted a holy artifact by one of his clerics to solidify that position, a golden cross bearing the image of Christ, which served as a standard, boosting the morale of his men. This new aura of adoration attracted Robert of Normandy, who switched sides and took his men out of the Provençal camp and marched up north.
So Ramon's all by himself.
Even saw some of his own Provençal bannermen abandon him.
Wow. How the mighty has fallen.
Apart from not knowing if and when the Fatimids would send a relief force, the Latins struggled with the lack of woodlands around Jerusalem, which were needed to build siege weapons. But then one day, as Tancred made his way into a cave to relieve himself during a bout of dysentery, he found a small stack of wood hidden inside. Once a few scaling ladders were constructed, the Crusaders launched their first assault on June 13th.
That's lucky.
The climb up the wall was extremely difficult, and a great skirmish ensued. On top of the battlements, some defenders used two-handed swords, using brute force to cut down the attackers, severing limbs and sending bodies flying down. Both sides sustained heavy casualties, but in the end, the first assault ended in failure.
Oof.
This defeat convinced the Franks to change their strategy, and both Crusader camps agreed to avoid further assaults until the necessary siege weapons were built, despite lacking the materials and craftsmen needed for siege towers, rams, or catapults. Sitting in the middle of the arid hills under the hot summer sun, with no drinkable water around them, the Crusaders began to suffer the effects of thirst. One chronicler recounted, "We suffered so badly from thirst that we sewed up the skins of oxen and buffaloes, and we used to carry water in them for the distance of nearly 6 miles. We drank the water from these vessels, although it stank, and with that foul water and barley bread, we endured great distress and affliction every day, for the Saracens used to lie in wait for our men by every spring and pool, where they killed them and cut them to pieces."
This is a horrible, horrible life to be a Crusader. My God.
Some of the marsh water was so contaminated that men even accidentally swallowed leeches, causing a painful death.
Oh God.
But right when all hope seemed lost, on June 17th, 6 ships, most of them Genoese, docked at Jaffa. Unbeknownst to the Franks, the port they didn't bother to secure was left abandoned. A messenger was sent out and arrived at the dismayed Crusader camp. The Latins then dispatched 3 squadrons, the first under Geldemar Capnel with 20 knights and 50 infantry, 50 knights under Raymond of Pilet, and finally William of Sabran with an unspecified but similar number of men. On their way to Jaffa, the first group encountered a 600-strong Fatimid detachment, which engaged them.
Oof.
Just when the Crusaders were about to flee, the second group under Pilet arrived and pushed the Fatimids back. The battered Crusaders arrived at Jaffa and feasted with the sailors, who welcomed them with bread, wine, and fish.
I bet that was nice after, I almost would feel bad, you have all your people back in Jerusalem suffering and you're in Jaffa just partying it up, basically.
The celebration lasted all through the night, with no sentries posted, and as a result, the Latins woke up and saw a large Fatimid fleet surrounding the 6 western vessels.
Ooh.
The port was overrun before everyone made their escape. Still, the majority made their way back to Jerusalem, carrying supplies and siege materials. In the following days, some of the Christians expelled from the city met up with the princes and advised them on where to find wood. The leadership sent out squads who cut it down and transported it back on camels, starting the construction of several siege engines. The construction itself led to yet another confrontation after one of the key engineers defected from the Provençal to the northern camp. Morale was so low that Raymond had to pay his own men extra wages just so they would stay, but tensions only rose.
Dang.
One of the main arguments that followed the Crusaders since Antioch was who was going to be the Lord of Jerusalem.
Well, we know it's not Ramon.
The princes disagreed on who to crown as king, while the priests argued that it would be sinful to raise a king over God's patrimony, suggesting that the city should be governed by the church and protected by a holy order. Chronicler and Crusader Raymond of Aguilera described this situation as such. "We now called a meeting because of the general quarrels among the leaders, and specifically because Tancred had seized Bethlehem. There he had flown his banner over the Church of the Lord's Nativity, as if over a temporal possession. The assembly also posed the question of the election of one of the princes as a guardian of Jerusalem, in case God gave it to us." In between devotion and desperation, the hard work continued, as the Crusaders built two of the finest siege towers of the time. Each one was 3 stories tall, with wheeled platforms designed to push up against a wall, protecting its passengers from projectiles. The towers were covered by interwoven branches and animal hides. Godfrey's tower was even designed
Those things are very flammable, though.
in a way that it could be disassembled in parts and repositioned on another section of the wall if needed. Additionally, the Crusaders built a huge ram with an ironclad head, several catapults, numerous scaling ladders, and a few protective screens. Meanwhile, Raymond ordered his soldiers to fill the moat in front of the Zion Gate with rocks, a process which took 3 days and nights. On the other side of the walls, the Fatimids maneuvered their own catapults to the sections of the walls the Crusaders intended to hit, and began to bombard them. The barrage slowed down the Frankish progress, so in order to intimidate the defenders, a noble Muslim captive was beheaded in full view of the Tower of David. The Crusaders also caught a spy relaying messages in and out of the city. After questioning, the man was catapulted to his death as he crashed on top of the stones piled in the moat.
My God.
The garrison responded to this psychological warfare by fixing crosses on the battlements, which they then spat and urinated on. A rumor began to spread that this was an indication that the Muslims were desecrating the Holy Sepulchre. In early July, one of the clergymen reported yet another vision of Bishop Adhemar, who allegedly instructed the Crusaders to lead a religious procession around the city walls with bare feet. As
Bro, just fight. Just fight.
the huge mass of people passed along the walls blowing trumpets, they were bombarded by the garrison,
No
which
shit.
resulted in many men, especially priests, being pierced by arrow fire. Desperate, yet full of bloodlust and determination, the Crusaders readied themselves for another assault.
Like, all that just to get everyone killed. Like, just fight. Then do all that after.
On July 14th, as daylight broke across a reddened sky, a horn cried out through the camp, announcing the beginning of the attack. To the dismay of the Muslim garrison, Godfrey managed to fool them by building his tower in different locations for the past 3 weeks, staring directly at the quadrangular tower. During the night before the assault, he had it reassembled and moved to St. Stephen's Gate, which was one of the greatest technological achievements of the era. On the northern front, for hours many brave men pushed the massive ram towards the wall, inch by inch, until they used it to tear down a part of the wall. The defenders then poured fire kindled from sulfur, pitch and wax, setting it ablaze. The Latins frantically threw the remainder of their water supply, trying to save the ram, but only charred beams remained. But then, in an almost comical reversal, the Crusaders lit the construction on fire again, so that it would clear the path through the breach.
The fight was so intense that it even included civilians who did what they could to defend the walls. We are given a particularly interesting scene from one of the chroniclers. 2 women were trying to hex one of our catapults, but a stone powerfully flung from the same machine struck the woman as they sang. Along with 3 little girls, their souls cut down and the incantations ceased. Wow.
Seeing this, now the Fatimids started throwing buckets of water, but before long the ram was gone and the breach was now fully open. On the southern side, Remor had far less success, since the majority of the garrison was positioned in his location. That included 9 out of the 14 catapults at the garrison's disposal.
Jeez.
Big rocks were hurled at them, alongside hails of arrows. As the siege engine came closer to the walls, flaming pieces of wood were also added to the barrage, after being wrapped in pitch, wax,
Ramont is up against it all. Poor Ramont.
and rags. Many of the projectiles had nails attached to them, so they would stick in whatever they struck. The fortifications, ditches, and defenders proved to be an unassailable obstacle, and the tower had to eventually pull back. By the end of the first day, the news was mixed. But one thing became clear. Their enemies had just as much determination as the Crusaders did.
Oh yeah, they're fighting for their lives.
On the morning of the 15th of July, the onslaught continued. Remor's tower approached the wall again, and it was once more repelled by a barrage of catapult fire until it started to burn and collapsed. The other tower, bearing the Golden Cross standard and filled with men including Godfrey of Bouillon himself, moved slowly towards its destination, just one well-placed shot away from collapsing on top of the Crusaders and all of their hopes. The garrison fired upon them with slings, and hurled flaming projectiles dipped in oil and grease, setting some of the men and portions of the tower on fire. Indeed, Godfrey nearly met his death when a stone was hurled and instantly killed the soldier standing next to him. The Duke then grabbed his crossbow and fired back at the crew manning the catapult. The tower managed to prevail, thanks to how well it was built, since most of the fire was repelled by the animal hides,
I thought the animal hides would actually be incendiary.
allowing it to make its way to the wall. Once they got close and had the height advantage, the Crusaders started returning fire, clearing the wall of enemy archers. They were no more than a meter away when the Fatimids used their secret weapon, reserved
Greek fire? Well, what's the secret weapon?
only for the direst of circumstances: Greek fire.
Do it.
Several flaming projectiles were hurled at the tower, producing flames that could not be put out by water. But when the commander of the garrison expelled his Christian citizens, he also gave the Crusaders the antidote. Prior to the battle, the princes were given a crucial piece of advice. Greek fire could be neutralized by vinegar, so they made sure to fill many wineskins with the liquid, which was now poured over the Fatimid secret weapon. Either due to a combustible substance being mishandled, or due to Crusader fire, a nearby guard tower was lit ablaze and produced so much smoke that no defender could stand near it. In this crucial moment, Godfrey ordered his men to prepare and cut loose one of the skins that held the tower together, unleashing a makeshift bridge. The Crusaders were on the walls of Jerusalem at
Oh, they're on the walls. It's over, basically.
midday. Ludolf of Tournai and his brother Engelbert were the first men to set foot in the Holy City, rushing forward and establishing a foothold. Shields were raised, and in the commotion, a squad of men underneath brought a scaling ladder and attached it to the same section of the wall. At that point, the Muslim garrison panicked and lost all cohesion, every man fleeing for their life. The Crusader reputation preceded them, and all it took was a single breach for the entire city to fall. News spread to the southern front, where Muslim defenders abandoned their posts, some even jumping from the walls to their death, and Remor pressed the advantage as he entered the city.
Wow. That's all it took.
The First Crusade had achieved its goal, but instead of celebration, what they proceeded to do was unspeakable.
Who would have thought?
This was the greatest victory in the history of the Crusades, and it culminated in one of the most atrocious acts committed in the medieval era. Eyewitness Remor of Aguilé reported, "With the fall of Jerusalem and its towers, one could see marvelous works. Some of the pagans were mercifully beheaded, others pierced by arrows plunged from towers, and yet others, tortured for a long time, were burned to death in searing flames. Piles of heads, hands, and feet lay in the houses and streets, and men and knights were running to and fro over corpses."
Crazy, isn't it?
Many Muslims fled to the Temple Mount, while Crusaders like Tancred and Gaston of Bîme gave a group of men stranded on the roof of the Temple of Solomon their banners for protection. But once discovered by other Crusaders, none were spared. To quote Raymond, "After a very great and cruel slaughter of the Saracens, of whom 10,000 fell in that same place, they put to the sword great numbers of Gentiles who were running about the quarters of the city, fleeing in all directions on account of their fear of death. They were stabbing women who had fled into palaces and dwellings, seizing infants by the soles of their feet from their mothers' laps or their cradles, and dashing them against the walls and breaking their necks. They were slaughtering some with weapons, or striking them down with stones.
Horrible.
They were sparing absolutely no Gentile of any place or kind."
Horrible.
The only Muslim inhabitants who survived seemed to be the garrison commander and the elite cavalry, who locked themselves in the Tower of David, and later negotiated terms with Raymond. As for the spoils, the chaos and emotions gave way to a systematically brutal approach. After this great massacre, they entered some of the homes of the citizens, seizing whatever they found in them. It was done systematically, so that whoever had entered the home first, whether he was rich or poor, was not to be harmed by anyone else in any way. He was to have and to hold the house or palace and whatever he had found in it entirely as his own. Since they mutually agreed to observe this rule, many poor men became rich. Tancred personally entered the Temple of Solomon and left with all the gold and precious stones he could carry. Once again, after discovering that many inhabitants had swallowed coins before their demise, many began to disembowel the thousands of bodies on the streets, creating a revolting stench. With their hands still laden with gold and covered in blood, the Latins rejoiced at the sight of the Holy Sepulchre, singing songs and thanking their Lord for his protection. This is the point where most narratives retold their adventures, and even the most biased takes couldn't ignore the severity of the crimes committed in the aftermath of the victory. On the next day, a few remaining Muslims were tasked with dragging the dismembered corpses out of the city, while Commander Iftikhar ad-Dawla surrendered the tower, and was safely passed towards the nearest Fatimid stronghold, the southern port of Ascalon, the site of the last battle.
Well, that's a lot, guys. That's a lot. Jerusalem is now in the Crusaders' hands. But at what cost? Atrocities. So many atrocities. In the name of the Lord. So many atrocities. Insane. Unmatched. Unmatched. Don't know what else to say, but yeah, that's just horrible. Those accounts are just horrible. I mean, a lot of this, that's what we do here. We react to history, react to war. There is atrocities in war, but it's not fun hearing about them sometimes. Because we're all humans. Like, at the end of the day, we're all humans. We're born separate times in separate places. Nature versus nurture, and this is what happens. It's insane. But they have it now, so their prized possession has been attained. This has been all the First Crusade's been about. Was this? Ramon is kind of like ousted, sort of, like he was like his own person a lot of the times throughout this last leg, and then at the end he has to really just hold his own at the Zion Gate. It's crazy though, but you know how it goes. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll check you guys. My words aren't wording. It's early. It's early in the morning right now. Thank you guys so much for watching. I appreciate you so much. I hope you have a great rest of your day. I'll catch you guys next time. Peace out. Bye-bye.